And even the least observant god could see it, if they looked, and they tried not to now. That up there, under the one tree, the design was almost done. The skeins of thread were running smaller and smaller. Only one black one and one bright one left. And then only half of one of the bright ones. And soon so little that there was just black fate left. It was then that Odin heard the unquiet news, coming to him by some dark spirit, that Hel had decorated her kingdom as if for a marriage celebration. And he gathered the great gods in council. And then he uttered the charm that can be spoken once and once only in all the immensity of time. The charm that brought hell to heaven. And at first there was nothing, no answer, just silence. And the gods looked round and Thor said, "Well, did it work?" And One Eye looked amazed, for he thought for a moment the charm would not hold. But then they heard it, far off at first, but the slow, steady pace. A great figure was coming towards them. Over Bifrost she stepped. They've heard her coming up bright Gladseam, and the flowers seemed to swither as she came. And the hall grew dark, and then a gale blew in, and there she stood, half white face, half black, writhen with runes of deep intensity. Living and dead, she came into the hall, and all the hall went silent, and all the hall went cold. And she was dressed as a groom, and in her hand she had a bridal veil. And she smiled and said, "I have come, Odin, not because you made me, but because I took the charm as an invitation." And Hel herself held up the parchment on which Odin's charm was written, and blew on it, and it turned to ash and wind and was blown. "I am free, but I have come to tell you that one of you is invited soon into my hall. In a matter of days he will come." And she turned and looked on Baldur the bright, Baldur the beautiful, Baldur the beloved, with lustful eyes. And he took a step back as she came up close to him, reaching out, put upon his head a bridal veil. "You will be mine, my dear." And Odin said, "What?" And Hel looked at him and said, "There is nothing you can do, Valfather. Baldur is mine." And then she was gone. And when she was gone, the bridal veil turned to cobwebs and was gone too. And then Baldur said, "Well, I will embrace whatever fate comes my way. Let us not be too disheartened." But Frigg, his mother, cried and cried and said, "I cannot have my beautiful, beautiful son taken from me. It cannot be." And Odin said, "No, it cannot be." For he knew as sure as he knew he was, that the fate of the gods, and beyond that, the fate of everything, was bound up with Baldur. As long as he stood beautiful upon the plain, all was safe, for the sun would rise under his light. But once Baldur was gone, there was nothing keeping the gods from their doom. "No, it cannot be," said Odin. And Frigg said, "But Baldur is so loved. All love him, for he is sunlight itself." And then Thor said, "Well, he has to be slain by something. Perhaps if all really do love him, they'll all swear not to hurt him. And Frigg said, that's a plan. And before anyone could stop her, she had gone to the stable and got Sleipnir and was on it, and going round heaven whispering, do you promise not to harm Baldur? And all the gods and all the trees and all the blades of grass promised to not hurt Baldur. And when Odin saw that, he said, that is the thing, my wife. On Sleipnir you can travel to all the worlds there are, each of the 7 worlds. And if you can persuade everything in all those worlds not to harm Baldur, then he cannot be killed, and he will remain here in heaven. And Frigg laughed. Now Sleipnir could ride to all the worlds there are in the winking of an eye, even if he never went to the wood that went between the worlds. And so it was. In each of the world and in every creature, Frigg would come up and say, do you love Baldur? For he is the bright sunlight. He is what allows you to see and to feel. Do you not love Baldur as you love your life? And everybody agreed. They did, and promised not to harm him. And Frigg made them write a bind rune there and then, binding the charm. She even went to the south, to far Surt, and Surt, seeing her mother's love, and even fire giants have mothers, agreed, as did Thrym. Even Fenris, the wolf, agreed not to hurt Baldur, the beautiful, for he needed the sunlight to be at all. And although he had never felt a mother's love, he could feel love still. And so, smiling, and having gone for the wink of an eye, Frigg rode back, tired, to heaven. And she said, everything has agreed. Every animal, but every vegetable, every mineral, gold itself has agreed not to harm Baldur. Gold, said Thor. Let's see. And he picked up then a goblet. It was a light goblet, and he threw it at Baldur's head gently. And Baldur didn't reach out to catch it, but let the goblet fall towards him. But just as it fell towards him, it bounced off. And Baldur said, well, wow. And Thor said, that was fun. Perhaps I should try something harder. And he took a ball, like a cricket ball, and he threw it at Baldur. And Baldur did not flinch, and the ball flew off and hit Thor straight in the eye. And Thor said, right, now we're going to see it. And he took out his great hammer, and he brought the hammer full down on Baldur's head. And the hammer bounced back off and caught Thor full in the forehead, knocking him out for the day. And then the great gods laughed and laughed, for this seemed fun. And some threw paper, and some threw darts and swords and axes, and they all bounced off Baldur. And Odin, Old One-Eye, said, not in Valhalla, go to bright Gladseem if you must do that. And so they all went off to the great combat field, and there they laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed, throwing things at Baldur. But try as they might, every one bounced off him. All the gods were soon at it, all save blind Hodi, who sat, forgotten, at the rim, wanting to join, but unable to throw anything. Forgotten again. It was just at that moment that Loki came back. Now, it wasn't a total coincidence, for Frigg had met Loki in the Far East, and he had sworn, against his better judgment, never to hurt Baldur, Baldur who he hated, Baldur who he resented, for it was because of Baldur's bright, beautiful presence that Loki, the blood brother of Odin, had been frozen out of his council. But still, Loki, in memory of his old love for Odin, had agreed. And in answer, Frigg had invited him back to heaven. And so here he was, coming in quietly, unannounced. And there was a great and riotous game going on. And he looked round, and there was just Hodi, unable to partake. And he came up to Hodi and said, why can't you throw things? Why can't you throw things? And Hodir looked at him when he said it the second time. And Loki saw that Hodir was blind. Now, Loki had been gone a long time, and Hodir did not know who he was. And he pointed to his eyes and said, I love my brother Baldur. I wish I could see him in this moment of his glory. Everything in the world won't hurt him, and so they're throwing stuff at him. And isn't it such fun? And I wish I could join. I wish I could. And he said it with such poignancy that for a moment Loki was touched, as he thought he could never be touched in Gladseem again. This poor lad, he thought. Excluded as I was excluded. And he whispered to him, don't worry, I'll find you a missile. And so he went out of heaven, for the gods had taken pretty much everything that you could throw and thrown it already at Baldur. As he left, or prepared to leave Asgard, he saw on the far side of the wall there was a mighty timber, for the gods had been trying to repair the iron plank wall of Asgard, but not being giants, they had not had much luck. And he looked at the great trunk and thought, well, that would be a thing to truck. That would indeed. And he tried to lift up the tree, but there was no good. It was too heavy. And he lifted it a bit, and he dropped it, moving his toe out just in time. And the great piece of wood crashed back down to the ground. But something broke off it. And he saw at once. It was not, as he had first thought, a branch, for it was a different colour. Made of green and gold, it seemed to him. And he picked it up, and he saw it had a very sharp edge, as if it was stuck, like some sort of dart, into the iron wood, the tree that grew between the worlds. And he laughed and he said, well, this will take a lovely dart indeed. And he broke off bits of the mistletoe, until it was a sharp, sharp dart. And then quietly he crept back into Gladseem, up to where Hodir was waiting. And then when Hodir was moved forward by Loki, hiding shadow-like behind him, and coming up to Baldur, all the gods parted and laughed. This should be fun! Hodir is going to throw! Hodir, Hodir, Hodir! And Hodir brought back his hand, and Loki guided it. And Baldur, smiling at his poor blind brother in love, turned his head to meet the arrow of that which is forgotten, which went straight into his eye, piercing his brain, and Baldur, making neither sound or sigh, fell forward dead. And Loki, seeing that, vanished, vanishing to the roots of things. One Eye looked amazed, and he went up to Hodir and said, What has gone on? And Hodir said, I just threw something at my brother. Is it okay? And Odin wept. He wept for Baldur and he wept for Hodir, for he must tell what he had done. And when Hodir heard that his bright brother Baldur was dead, he took out a dagger and slew himself, saying, I shall go with him at least. And the great gods took the two bodies and they laid them out. And they went to council. And they were weeping and weeping and weeping with so much sorrow. And Odin, looking out, seemed to see that all the world was weeping. Not just Asgard, but all the seven worlds. There were so many tears. And so mounting Sniper, he flew first to the south. And there, to his amazement, he found Surtir, the great fire giant, Surt, still weeping. And Odin said, Why do you cry? And the fire giant said, I weep for Baldur, for that mother's love. And then Odin went and saw Thrym in the north. And Thrym said, I too weep for Baldur, for he was a great warrior and deserved a nobler death. And Odin visited every one and everything, and they were all weeping for Baldur, even Fenris, touched as he had been by Frigg's urgency. And he flew back up to heaven and said, Well, everything is weeping for Baldur. And then Frigg said, That might be be our chance. Remember, hell hates compassion. It beats upon her soul like a bright drum. Perhaps we can use it in some way? And Odin smiled and said, maybe. And mounting Snæpir, he rode off the heaven's great gate, and he smote upon the gate. And after a while he heard the same heavy footfall, and the great gate of hell opened. And for a moment Odin saw, inside there was bright Baldur, dressed indeed as a bride. But there was a figure that extinguished that vision. Hell herself stepped out in full armour. And Odin, who was quick, shot past her and closed the door of hell, locking her on the outside and standing between. And hell, turning round, said, "What do you want?" And then she felt it, beating on her head, all the tears of compassion. And she cried and said, "No!" Can you not feel the sorrow of all the world beating on your head, and with that sorrow you are caught? And hell reeled, and then she turned and seemed to listen, and after the briefest of moments, smiled a nasty smile and said, "Not quite all. As long as one does not weep, I do not need to give you Baldur. And there is a giantess on the northwest coast of Norway, who they call She Who Cannot Weep, who keeps her counsel yet." And hell turned herself into a shadow, and before Odin knew quite what had happened, she had vanished through the keyhole of hell. And then Odin mounted Snæpir, and riding Snæpir went back off to Asgard. And so he missed the shadow. For Loki, in his fear of what he had done, had crept down to the root of hell to be with his daughter, and he had heard all this. And his face appeared from the shadow, and fear had made him hate. And in that moment, and for the first time, he hated Odin. He hated him with a passion. He didn't care that they'd once been dear to him. He didn't care that they were blood brothers. Odin had always favoured Baldur. Odin hated him, so he must hate Odin in reply. "Let us see if this is true," he said. And going as fast as thought, he went to the very northwest coast of Norway. And there was a mighty, mighty cave. A cave he wondered if he recognised. "But I have gone so far and seen so much," he thought. "But this is the cave of the giantess, of She Who Cannot Weep. Let us see." And there was a child playing in front of the cave. What sort of child? He wasn't sure. How old it was? He wasn't sure. Physically, for a giantess, it looked about 7, but its eyes looked older. But Loki didn't look long. He took out a dagger and killed it, and then said, "Come out, come out, come out and see what I have done." And a great figure shambled out. Now she was all dirt and mud, and her face was wrinkled and mottled and partially green, and she had great black, sad eyes. And she said, "Hello again, Loki." And then she took the murdered child, and rather than laying it out, she laid it upon a table that was there on the outside of the cave, and going back into the cave, came back with the implements to make a fire and a frying pan. And without blinking an eyelid, she cooked the child and said, "Come, Loki, come eat with me again." And Loki, who didn't recognise her, not yet, sat down, and she gave Loki one of the child's legs, and he thought to himself, "Well, it is true, she can't weep. I've killed her child or her grandchild, and there's not a single tear." And they were eating the meat when the giantess turned and said, "Do you not know me now?" and smiled, and her uneven teeth looked menacing. And then she looked defiant at Loki, and suddenly he knew who she was. "It's you! Baldur!" And she smiled and said, "Yes. Do you not know what you're eating? This daughter was your own. It was the fourth child I had, the one made of all the oddments after our great and monstrous children were born. I've kept her long, and always known she would serve some purpose at the last." And Loki, knowing he was eating his child, spat it out. But it was no good. The child was dead. So, when his plate was refilled, he ate it and felt evil course into his vein. He didn't care anymore. And then Baldur took him, as once she had taken him before, into the very dark of her cave for the night. Meanwhile, up in heaven, the gods were gathered in council. All through the night they had debated. And in the end, Thor summed it up. "Now, I accept with Tyr and with Odin, it isn't really just to kill her, just because she can't weep. I do see that argument, and I do see it well, but in the end, the ends must justify the means. She stands between us and the possibility we don't all die and all of creation doesn't pitch into oblivion. Surely that's worth her life. In the end, she's just a giantess. Shall I do it?" And Odin said, "No. No, as the dogs bark, no. It must be me." And so he mounted, as the dawn broke, Snæpir, and came to the very western end of northwestern coastline of Norway, and found the cave at last. And then he drew his sword, but he stood outside irresolute as the morning grew red. And a voice rang out and said, "Odin, did the one eye make you cautious at the last? The great god I once knew, the great god I once knew, with his two eyes was braver. He would have rushed in to demand what he wanted of a maiden. Whichever cave she lived in, so he did. And you stand outside like a murderer, grey, scruffy, call yourself a god." And Odin felt ashamed through his grief at what he must do. And a second time, the figure shuffled out, and she seemed slightly younger, and her eyes were defiant, and her voice had changed. It had become a lot younger. "You do not know me, do you, Odin? Well, not yet." And she lifted up her hair and bore her neck, and said, "If you must strike she who cannot weep, do it. For I cannot weep. I will not weep." And Odin started to pull out his sword. But the giantess continued, "But know this, if you slay me unjustly, the blood will not just be on your conscience, but will fall on Baldur also. And bright Baldur will bear that wound till beyond the end of time." And Odin stood irresolute, unable to draw out his sword. And then, suddenly, he saw the neck, the giantess's neck, that seemed to have grown graceful, seemed to have grown young, and her hair had once been red and luxurious, and her eyes, although full of challenge, were now full of grief. And he knew that neck. He had once kissed it, and she smiled and said, "Yes, I am all that is left of Surting's daughter, who once you seduced in this cave and then left, taking what you want and left me to my fate. And so I became Agna Baldur, and my grief turned to hate. And so at last I became what I am, a creature beyond sadness, whose heart was broken so long ago. I have no hate and no tears to give. I am what you left me, Odin. So, can you slay me now?" And Odin put back the sword in the sheath and turned to go. And the giantess went back towards the cave. Now, just at that moment, Loki, who had been terrified that Odin would kill her and come into the cave, for he knew that Odin would blame him for the death of Hodir, because Hodir would certainly, before he killed himself, have told Odin as much, crept out. Now, he crept out as a shadow. He meant to be unseeable. And yet, Odin's bright eye burned. And more than that, they were still blood brothers. Odin could feel Loki's passing so close. And he turned and saw the shadow fleet. And then he jumped upon Snæpir. And Odin pursued Loki. Across the heavens he pursued him. Through the 9 worlds he pursued him. Down into the very roots of time. Down where the tree itself. Down where it grew. And there, where he had thrown once Ymir's brain and liver and heart, he caught Loki. And then, uttering such a charm, he conjured the roots that were there, and they became like snakes, and they bound Loki fast. And he hung one last root over Loki's head, as to be a poisoned snake, dripping in Loki's face. And Loki struggled, and the earth shook. And Loki said, "You cannot leave me here! You know what you once swore. You once swore that we were blood brothers, that I would be forever at your counsel, that you would not banish me." "I know what I swore," said Odin, "that I would not banish you until the world's end, and that if I banished you, the world must end, as must it do." And so saying, Odin left Loki struggling and slowly rode back to Bifrost. And when he came to that old gate once again, he stopped and thought for a moment and said, as if making it for the first time, "Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself must likewise die, even great gods die. But I will tell you what never dies, the verdict on each one gone." And he snorted and he said, "All these years I didn't realise. All that struggle, that desire to be, that was the emptiness. In the end, eternity is not existing, it is doing. It is the memory of what I've done." And he smiled, and for a moment he felt reconciled with all he had been, and all he could yet be before the end. And he snorted. And thinking that, he took pity for a moment upon Loki, his old blood brother, who he had banished. And opening up a small portal, he allowed Loki's wife, who he had married in the Far East, to find her husband, so that she might keep the poison from his face most of the time. And with one last act of compassion done, Odin strode into the gates of Asgard, with the plank wall still partially breached, and prepared to meet his fate as the Norns started the final black skiing of time.